Smart women follow these 7 rules. There is a moment that most people miss, but it changes everything when you begin to notice it. It is the space between what happens and how you respond. For many, that space does not exist. Something is said and the reaction is immediate. An emotion rises and it turns into action without awareness. It feels natural, almost automatic. But a smart woman begins to see this pattern clearly. She notices how quickly reactions come, how easily emotions take control when there is no pause, and she begins to understand that reacting instantly is not a sign of strength. It is a habit of the unobserved mind, so she starts to slow down, not in a forced way, not trying to suppress anything, but simply becoming aware of what is happening inside her. When a situation triggers her, she feels it fully, the emotion is there, the thoughts begin to form. But instead of following them immediately, she pauses, and in that pause, something powerful appears, clarity. Because when you do not react instantly, you begin to see more. You notice the tone behind words, not just the words themselves. You see the situation more completely, not just the part that triggered you. You understand your own emotion instead of being controlled by it. At first, this feels unfamiliar. The mind wants to respond quickly. It feels like if you don't react, you are holding something back. But she stays with the pause, and slowly it becomes natural. She begins to understand that emotions are not the problem. The problem is when emotions turn into immediate reactions without awareness. Because in that moment you are not choosing, you are simply following a pattern. And patterns do not always lead to the right direction. So she practices observing. When anger rises, she notices it before speaking. When frustration appears, she feels it without immediately expressing it. When something feels uncomfortable, she allows herself a moment before reacting. And this moment changes everything because in that moment she has a choice. She can respond calmly instead of reacting impulsively. She can stay silent instead of saying something she might regret. She can step back instead of being pulled into unnecessary conflict. And over time, these choices build strength, not loud strength, not visible strength, but inner strength, a stability that does not shake easily. She also begins to see how this changes her relationships. When she reacts less, there is less misunderstanding. When she observes more, there is more clarity. Conversations become more meaningful, less emotional, more grounded. People begin to feel this difference because most interactions are driven by a reaction. One reaction triggers another, and the cycle continues. But when she does not react immediately, that cycle breaks, and in that break there is space for understanding. She also notices how this affects her mind. There is less noise, less overthinking, less emotional exhaustion, because she is no longer feeding every thought and feeling with immediate action. She is allowing things to pass, and what passes does not stay heavy. She understands now that observing before reacting is not about becoming slow or passive. It is about becoming aware. It is about creating space between impulse and action, because in that space she is no longer controlled by what happens. She is choosing how to respond, and that choice becomes her power. A quiet power that does not need to prove itself, but is felt in her calmness, her clarity, and her ability to remain steady when everything around her tries to pull her into reaction. And in that steadiness she becomes someone who is not easily shaken, not easily influenced, and not easily lost in the moment. She becomes someone who sees first and responds with intention. There comes a point where a woman begins to realize that not everything deserves her words. For a long time, She may have felt the need to explain herself, to make others understand her intentions, her decisions, her feelings. It felt like clarity would come if she just said a little more, if she just expressed herself a little better. But over time, she begins to notice something. The more she explains, the more drained she feels, not because speaking is wrong, but because not every situation is meant to be solved with words. Some people are not listening to understand, they are listening to respond. Some situations are not looking for clarity. They are driven by emotion, misunderstanding, or fixed perspectives, and in those moments, explanation does not bring peace. It creates more noise, so she starts to observe this pattern. She notices when she is about to over-explain, when she is trying to prove something, when she is speaking not from calm understanding, but from a subtle need to be validated. And instead of continuing, she pauses. She chooses silence. At first, this feels uncomfortable because silence can be misunderstood. It can feel like she is leaving something unfinished, like she is not defending herself, like she is allowing others to assume things. But she stays with it, and slowly she begins to understand something deeper. Silence is not weakness. It is clarity without unnecessary effort, because when you know your truth, you do not feel the need to repeat it endlessly. You do not feel the need to convince everyone. You understand that not everyone will see things the way you do, and that is okay. She also begins to see how silence protects her energy. Every explanation requires mental effort, emotional involvement, and attention. And when this is given to situations that do not deserve it, it creates exhaustion. But when she chooses silence, she keeps that energy within herself. She becomes more centered, more grounded, less affected by external reactions. She also notices that silence creates a different kind of presence. When she is not constantly speaking, her words carry more weight. When she chooses when to speak, her voice becomes more intentional. And when she remains silent in unnecessary moments, it creates a sense of calm around her. People begin to feel this because silence is not empty. It communicates, it shows self-control, it shows confidence, but it shows that she is not easily pulled into every situation. She also begins to understand that not every misunderstanding needs correction. Some things reveal themselves over time. Some people understand later, and some will never understand, no matter how much you explain. And she becomes at peace with that because her goal is no longer to control how she is perceived. Her focus is to remain aligned within herself. She also learns the difference between silence and suppression. She does not ignore her voice when it matters. She speaks when something is important, when boundaries need to be expressed, when truth needs to be shared. But she no longer speaks out of pressure, she speaks out of clarity, and that difference changes everything. There is less regret in her words, less emotional reaction, more intention. She understands now that silence is not about avoiding communication. It is about choosing meaningful communication. It is about knowing when words add value and when they only create more confusion. And in that awareness, she becomes more powerful, not because she speaks more, but because she speaks less with more purpose. There is a quiet confidence in her presence. She does not rush to fill every gap with words. She does not feel uncomfortable with pauses. She allows space in conversations, in situations, in emotions. And in that space, she remains steady, calm, aware, because she knows that her worth is not measured by how much she explains, but by how deeply she understands herself. And when that understanding is strong, silence becomes natural, not forced, not distant, but peaceful. A reflection of someone who no longer needs to prove, only to be. There comes a quiet moment when a woman realizes that saying yes to everything is slowly taking something away from her. Not all at once, not in a dramatic way, but in small pieces, her energy, her peace, her sense of self. For a long time, she may have believed that being kind meant being available, that being understanding meant tolerating more than she should. But over time, she begins to feel the weight of it. The conversations that drain her, the situations that don't feel right but continue anyway. The moments where she agrees even when something inside her hesitates, and that hesitation becomes important because it is not weakness, it is awareness. She starts to listen to it. At first, it feels uncomfortable to say no. There is a fear of disappointing others, of being misunderstood, of creating distance. Because when you are used to being accommodating, choosing yourself can feel unfamiliar. But she begins to understand something deeper. Every time she ignores her own boundary, she creates internal conflict, a quiet tension that stays with her long after the moment has passed. And that tension slowly affects how she feels about herself. So she begins to shift, not in a loud or aggressive way, but in a calm, steady way. She starts with small decisions, declining things that don't align with her energy, stepping back from situations that feel draining, choosing not to engage when something feels unnecessary. And each time she does this, something changes inside her. There is a sense of relief, a feeling of alignment, as if she is finally listening to herself instead of constantly adjusting for others. She also begins to understand that boundaries are not about pushing people away. They are about creating space where she can exist comfortably. They define what she accepts, what she gives, and where she stands. And when these boundaries are clear, interactions become clearer too. People begin to understand how to approach her, what is acceptable, what is not because she explains it constantly, but because she lives it consistently. She also realizes that setting boundaries without guilt is an important part of this process, because guilt often comes from old patterns. The belief that choosing yourself is selfish, that saying no is wrong, that prioritizing your peace means neglecting others. But she begins to see that this is not true, because when she respects her own boundaries, she shows others how to respect them too. And this creates healthier connections, not based on overgiving or silent discomfort, but based on mutual understanding. She also notices that when she sets boundaries calmly without anger or defensiveness, they are received differently. There is no need to argue, no need to justify excessively. A simple, clear response is enough, and this clarity becomes her strength because she is no longer trying to control how others react. She is simply staying aligned with herself. She also understands that not everyone will accept her boundaries. Some people may resist, some may not understand, some may prefer the version of her that said yes to everything. And she becomes okay with that because her goal is not to please everyone. Her goal is to remain true to herself. There is a quiet confidence that comes from this, a sense of stability because she knows she will not abandon herself to maintain comfort or approval. And that trust in herself becomes a foundation. She begins to move differently, with more clarity, with more intention, with more respect for her own time and energy. And this changes how others see her, not because she demanded respect, but because she embodied it. She understands now that boundaries are not walls. They are guidelines for how she moves through life. And when those guidelines are clear, everything becomes simpler. Less confusion, less tension, less internal conflict. She feels lighter, more at peace, more connected to herself. Because she is no longer ignoring what she needs, she is honoring it. And in that honor, she finds strength. A strength that does not come from controlling others, but from standing firmly within herself without guilt, without fear, and without the need to explain more than necessary. There is a quiet shift that happens when a woman stops focusing on how others see her and begins to focus on how she is growing within herself. For a long time, it's easy to look outward at validation, at recognition, at whether others notice the effort. But slowly, she begins to understand that real growth is not something that needs an audience. It is something that happens in private. In the moments when no one is watching, when there is no praise, no feedback, no external reward, just her and the choice to improve, even slightly. At first, this kind of discipline feels unnoticed. She may question if it matters, if small efforts really make a difference. But she continues anyway. She chooses to learn something new even when it feels slow. She chooses to reflect on her thoughts even when it's uncomfortable. She chooses to improve her habits even when there is no immediate result. And over time, these small actions begin to build something powerful. Not something visible right away, but something internal, clarity. She starts to understand herself better, her patterns, her reactions, her strengths, her weaknesses. And this understanding allows her to grow in a way that is real, not superficial. She also notices that when her focus is on growth, comparison begins to fade, because comparison only exists when your attention is outside. But when your attention is within, there is nothing to compare, only progress to observe. She is no longer measuring herself against others. She is measuring herself against who she was yesterday, and that changes her mindset completely. There is less pressure to compete and more motivation to improve. She also begins to see that self-growth is not about becoming perfect. It is about becoming aware. Aware of what needs to change, aware of what needs to be strengthened, aware of what no longer aligns. And this awareness leads to intentional action, not forced, not rushed, but consistent. She understands now that growth does not happen in one big moment. It happens in small decisions repeated daily, choosing patience instead of reaction, choosing discipline instead of distraction, choosing understanding instead of assumption. And these choices slowly shape who she becomes. She also notices that as she grows internally, her external life begins to reflect it. Her decisions become clearer, her responses become calmer, her presence becomes more grounded. Not because she is trying to appear a certain way, but because her inner state has changed. She becomes more focused, less distracted by unnecessary things, more aligned with what truly matters. And this alignment creates a sense of direction. She is no longer moving randomly, she is moving intentionally. She also understands that growth requires honesty. Being honest with herself about where she is, what she needs to improve, and what she needs to let go of. And while this honesty can be uncomfortable, it is also freeing because it removes illusion. It brings clarity, and clarity allows real progress. She no longer avoids her weaknesses, she learns from them. She no longer hides from her mistakes, she reflects on them. And this mindset makes her stronger, not in a loud or visible way, but in a steady, grounded way. She begins to trust her process, even when results are slow, even when progress feels small, because she knows that consistency creates change over time. And that trust gives her patience. She is no longer rushing to become something. She is allowing herself to grow into it. And in that process, she finds a quiet confidence, not based on external validation, but on internal progress. She knows she is improving, she feels it, and that feeling becomes enough. She understands now that investing in herself is the most reliable path she can take, because everything she builds within cannot be taken away. And over time, this investment becomes her strength, a strength built not in moments of attention, but in moments of quiet discipline and continuous growth. There is a moment when a woman realizes that chasing rarely brings what she truly wants. It may bring attention for a short time. It may create temporary connection, but it often leaves her feeling unsettled. Because when you are chasing, there is always a sense that something is missing, something that needs to be gained from outside. And that feeling creates imbalance. A chosen woman begins to notice this pattern in herself. The moments where she gives more than she receives, where she overthinks small changes in behavior, where she adjusts herself to maintain interest or attention. And slowly, she begins to feel how exhausting this becomes, because chasing is not just physical, it is energetic. It shows in the way she thinks, in the way she waits, in the way she tries to hold something that is not naturally staying. And this awareness becomes important because she begins to question it. She asks herself, what if I stop trying to make things happen and instead focus on becoming stable within myself? At first, this shift feels unfamiliar because chasing often feels like effort, and effort feels like progress. But she begins to understand that not all effort leads to the right direction. So, she slowly pulls her energy back, not in a defensive way, not to distance herself from others, but to reconnect with herself. She begins to focus on her own life, her growth, her peace, her direction. She gives attention to what she can control, her thoughts, her actions, her choices. And in doing this, something begins to change. She feels more grounded, less dependent on how others respond, less affected by external validation. And this grounded energy becomes noticeable because when someone is not seeking attention, their presence feels different. There is no pressure, no neediness, no subtle tension trying to pull something from others. And this absence of need creates attraction. She also begins to understand that attraction is not something you force. It is something that happens naturally when there is alignment. When she is aligned with herself, her values, her energy, her direction, she no longer feels the need to convince anyone to stay, because what is aligned will come, and what is not aligned will leave. And she becomes at peace with that. This peace changes how she interacts. She is more relaxed in conversations, less concerned with outcomes, more present in the moment. And this presence creates a different kind of connection, one that is not built on effort but on authenticity. She also notices that when she is not chasing, she has more clarity. She sees situations for what they are, not what she hopes them to be. She recognizes effort from others more clearly. She understands when something is mutual and when it is not. And this clarity protects her because she is no longer holding on to something that requires constant effort from only one side. She is allowing things to flow naturally. She also realizes that chasing often comes from a belief that she needs something outside to feel complete. But as she reconnects with herself, that belief begins to fade. She starts to feel whole within herself, not because everything is perfect, but because she is no longer looking outward for constant reassurance. And this sense of completeness changes everything, because when you feel complete, you do not approach connections from a place of need. You approach them from a place of choice, and that difference is powerful. She chooses who she gives her energy to. She chooses where she invests her time. She chooses what aligns with her, and this choice creates strength. She is no longer waiting to be chosen, she is choosing. And in that shift, attraction becomes natural, not because she is trying to create it, but because her energy is no longer scattered or dependent. It is focused, calm, grounded, and people feel that. Because in a world where many are chasing, someone who is centered within themselves stands out. Not loudly, not forcefully, but quietly. And that quiet presence becomes magnetic because it reflects something rare. A person who is not trying to gain something, but simply being fully themselves. And that is what naturally draws others in. There comes a deeper realization when a woman begins to see that everything she experiences is filtered through her inner world. Not just situations, not just people, but her thoughts, her emotions, her mindset. These quietly shape how life feels to her. At first, it is easy to believe that the outside world is the cause of everything. If things go well, she feels good. If things go wrong, she feels disturbed. It seems simple, almost automatic, but over time, she begins to notice something more subtle. The same situation does not always create the same feeling. Sometimes she responds calmly, sometimes she feels overwhelmed. Sometimes she understands, sometimes she reacts, and this inconsistency shows her that the situation itself is not the only factor. Her inner state matters, so she begins to observe it. She notices how her thoughts influence her emotions, how a single negative thought can create tension, and how a calm perspective can bring ease to the same moment. She sees how her mindset can either amplify a problem or soften it. And this awareness becomes powerful because she realizes that if her inner world shapes her experience, then learning to manage it changes everything. At first, this feels challenging because the mind is active, thoughts appear without invitation, emotions rise without warning. It feels like there is so much happening inside that controlling it seems impossible. But she begins to understand that control is not about stopping thoughts or forcing emotions away. It is about awareness. She starts to notice her thoughts instead of immediately believing them. When something negative appears, she does not follow it blindly. She observes it, questions it, allows it to pass, and in doing this, she creates space between herself and her thoughts. She also begins to notice her emotions in a different way. Instead of reacting immediately, she allows herself to feel without being overwhelmed. She understands that emotions are temporary, that they rise and fall if she does not hold on to them. And this changes how she responds. She is no longer pulled into every emotional wave. She remains more steady, more grounded, more aware. She also begins to shape her mindset intentionally, not by forcing positivity, but by choosing clarity. She asks herself better questions. She looks at situations with a wider perspective. She focuses on what she can control instead of what she cannot. And this creates stability because her mind is no longer moving in random directions. It has direction. She also notices how this inner control affects her outer life. Her decisions become more balanced. Her reactions become calmer. Her interactions become more thoughtful. People feel this difference because when someone is stable within themselves, it reflects in everything they do. There is less confusion, less emotional reaction, more presence. And this presence feels strong. She understands now that controlling her inner world is not about becoming perfect. It is about becoming aware enough to not be controlled by every thought and emotion. It is about choosing how she responds instead of reacting automatically. And this choice becomes her power, a power that does not depend on circumstances, a power that remains steady even when things around her change. She no longer feels like life is something happening to her. She feels like she is participating in it with awareness guiding her thoughts, understanding her emotions, shaping her mindset. And in doing this, she creates a different experience of life, one that is not driven by chaos, but by clarity. One that is not controlled by impulse, but by awareness, and this awareness becomes her foundation. Because when your inner world is stable, everything else becomes easier to navigate, not because challenges disappear, but because you are no longer lost within them. You remain centered, and from that center you move with calm, with intention, and with a quiet strength that does not need to be seen to be felt.